A racist cop humiliates a Latino man in the middle of the street without knowing that his brother is Bad Bunny. What started as an abuse of power took an unexpected turn when the artist arrived furiously at the scene. Cameras shouting outrage, and a reaction that left the officer completely frozen. You have to see what happened next. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The afternoon sun bathed the streets of Miami in a warm glow, reflecting off the windows of luxury stores. Javier stepped out of one of them at a leisurely pace, holding a thick paper bag with the logo of a well-known brand printed in golden letters. His outfit was impeccable. A fitted designer t-shirt, dark jeans, and freshly worn white sneakers. His destination was clear. His vehicle just a few meters away. A few meters away, inside a patrol car parked by the curb, Officer Reynolds watched him intently. The vehicle's air conditioning dulled the stifling heat, but not the discomfort he felt as he observed Javier. His gaze traced every detail of the well-dressed Latino man, meticulously analyzing his relaxed posture, the expensive bag hanging from his hand, and the confidence with which he walked among the passers-by. From his seat, he narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward as he rested an elbow on the window. Javier reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed quickly, as if writing something urgent. Then he glanced to both sides before putting it away again. Reynolds frowned. It was a common gesture. Yes, but something in his instinct told him he should pay attention. Reynolds didn't move immediately. He simply followed Javier with his eyes, watching as he maneuvered around a group of tourists exiting a watch store and crossed the street naturally. He had patrolled this area for years and could easily identify the regular boutique customers. However, something about the scene unsettled him, though he couldn't quite explain why. He adjusted his belt and repositioned the radio on his shoulder, keeping his eyes fixed on Javier, who continued walking. Traffic on the avenue crawled forward, and the hum of engines blended with the scattered conversations of pedestrians. Javier, unaware of the attention he was drawing, carried on without hurry. His mind was occupied with everyday thoughts, never suspecting that just a few meters away, a pair of eyes were watching him with growing interest, and a silent judgment was beginning to form. Reynolds shifted in his seat, feeling an inexplicable discomfort. Was it the way that man walked? The glint of the phone in his hand? He didn't know, but he was about to find out. A sudden sound shattered the tranquility. The red and blue lights of a police patrol began flashing while a brief, sharp siren cut through the bustle of the street. Without understanding what was happening, Javier turned his head toward the patrol car. The vehicle had stopped right behind him. A firm, authoritative voice rang out through the loudspeaker. "Stop right there." The pedestrians walking nearby slowed their pace. Some looked on with curiosity, while others preferred to ignore the scene and continue on their way. Javier frowned, trying to figure out if the order was directed at him or someone else. He looked around, but there was no one else immediately on the sidewalk. The doubt disappeared when the patrol car moved forward a few more meters, and the voice rang out again. "Stop, sir, do not move." A shiver ran down Javier's spine. His body reacted before his mind. He instinctively raised his hands and stood still on the sidewalk. He had no idea what was happening, but the last thing he wanted was to appear as a threat. Officer Reynolds stepped out of the car with firm strides and a stern gaze. He wore the standard blue uniform with a bulletproof vest over it. His hand rested near the gun on his belt, though he had not drawn it. As he approached, his hardened expression left no doubt. He was looking for a reason to exert his authority. "Identification," he ordered, not bothering to offer an explanation. Javier blinked, still not understanding. "What's going on, officer? Did I do something wrong?" Reynolds tilted his head slightly and narrowed his eyes, as if the question itself was a challenge. I asked for your identification. Show it to me. Now. Javier swallowed hard. His hands were still raised, and for a moment he hesitated. Would lowering one hand to retrieve his wallet be seen as a suspicious movement? He knew how these encounters could go wrong for people like him. Slowly, he lowered one hand and pointed to his pocket. I'm going to take it out. It's in my right pocket, he stated in a controlled voice. Reynolds didn't respond immediately. He maintained his rigid stance, watching every move Javier made as if expecting something unpredictable. Finally, with a brief nod, he allowed him to proceed. As Javier slowly lowered his hand to his pocket, he heard the faint creak of the officer's leather belt. He glanced sideways and saw Reynolds' hand resting on his service weapon. His concern was not unfounded. One wrong move and everything could spiral out of control. Javier carefully reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, opening it to show his ID without making any sudden movements. Reynolds took it without thanking or explaining anything. He examined the document for a few seconds, as if searching for something out of place. Then he looked up and studied Javier's face with the same intensity. Where are you coming from? Javier blinked. From the clothing store, 2 blocks from here. I bought a couple of things. Reynolds shifted his gaze to the bag hanging from Javier's hand. He recognized it immediately. It was from a luxury store. Nice bag, Reynolds commented, not looking away. Did you take it, or did you pay for it? Yeah, of course I paid, Javier replied, his tone now tenser. If you want, you can check the receipt. It's in the bag. Reynolds took another step closer, invading his personal space. His gaze sharpened, as if he had already decided the answer before hearing it. Don't lie to me. How did you get that? Look, officer, if you just let me show you the receipt, you'll see everything is fine, Javier said, keeping his voice steady. But Reynolds didn't move. There was something in his eyes beyond mere suspicion. It was a decision. He wasn't looking for the truth, just an excuse to keep control. Reynolds kept his gaze fixed on Javier, evaluating him. He hadn't done anything suspicious, but something about him was unsettling. Maybe it was his confidence. Maybe his clothes. Maybe the fact that he didn't seem as scared as Reynolds expected. I'm going to need you to come with me to the patrol car while I verify this, he finally said, making it clear that it wasn't a request. Javier felt the pressure in his chest tighten. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but he also knew that situations like this could become unpredictable in a matter of seconds. Javier remained calm despite the growing tension. With his shopping bag still in hand, he looked at the officer with a furrowed brow and asked firmly, "Why are you stopping me, officer?" Reynolds smirked mockingly before responding in a tone laden with disdain. "Comply, or I'll take you in for obstruction," he said in a grave voice, locking eyes with Javier, waiting for him to be intimidated. Javier felt a surge of frustration, but held back. He knew that any wrong move could be used against him. He took a deep breath and, with effort, avoided confronting him. Around him, the city continued its course, but something was changing. A few meters away, a couple waiting at the corner exchanged glances and took out their phones. A young man with headphones stopped when he noticed the scene. The officer's attitude and Javier's expression began to attract attention. At first, it was just a few, but within seconds, several passers-by paused to observe what was happening. Some took out their mobile devices and started recording. A murmur spread among the people. Reynolds turned his head and noticed the witnesses. His expression hardened, and he refocused on Javier, with no intention of backing down. "Hands on the car. Spread your legs," he ordered sharply. Javier felt a knot in his stomach. He had done nothing wrong, yet there he was, facing an officer who seemed determined to subdue him. He quickly looked around and realized that a sea of screens was pointed at him. He wasn't alone. Still, his heart pounded against his chest. For a moment, he had the terrible certainty that no matter how many witnesses were present, Reynolds would do whatever he wanted. No one could stop him. Javier stood firm, his breathing steady, as he stared directly at Officer Reynolds. The initial confusion had given way to a calm determination. He didn't understand why he was being detained, but he wasn't going to comply without getting answers. His voice was clear and controlled as he asked again, "Why are you stopping me, officer?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. Javier's composure irritated him. He was used to people being nervous or afraid in these situations, but this man wasn't reacting as he expected. He glanced at the people who had stopped to watch. Some already had their phones raised, recording. His fingers tensed over his belt as he let out an impatient huff. "Follow my orders and stop asking questions," he snapped authoritatively. "If you keep resisting, I'll take you in for obstruction." Javier frowned. He tried once more to get an answer. "I just want to know the reason for this detention. I'm not doing anything illegal." The officer clicked his tongue, frustration growing inside him. He felt the situation slipping out of his hands. He needed to reaffirm his authority. "I won't repeat myself," he said with a hint of mockery in his voice. "Put your hands on the car and do as I say." Javier pressed his lips together, feeling indignation rise in his chest. He reached into his pocket to take out his phone and start recording. As soon as he had the device in his hand, he felt a sharp blow to his wrist. "Don't you dare!" Reynolds roared, swiping at Javier's hand with a slap that made the phone wobble and stop recording. Javier felt a burning pain in his wrist and stepped back, shocked by the violent reaction. A man in the crowd cursed loudly. But then something worse happened. Reynolds reached for his belt. Was he pulling out a weapon? Javier thought. For an eternal second, Javier felt the air catch in his throat. He didn't dare move. The world seemed to shrink around him. "Why are you hitting me?" He finally burst out, breaking the spell of terror that had paralyzed him. Reynolds felt the pressure in his chest intensify. The number of eyes on him, the people recording, Javier's defiant attitude. It all pushed him to the edge of losing control. Without answering, he stepped forward and grabbed Javier's arm forcefully, twisting it abruptly before shoving him against the patrol car. The impact made Javier let out a pained gasp. "Hands on the car," Reynolds ordered sharply. "Spread your legs." Javier felt the officer's forearm press against his back, pinning him down. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had nothing to hide. This couldn't end like this. The officer began patting down his pockets without warning, ignoring Javier's protests. "You have no right to search me without cause," Javier exclaimed, struggling slightly. The crowd was no longer just silently recording. Outraged voices could be heard, some loudly asking why he was being treated that way. A woman raised her voice firmly. "That's abuse of power. Someone call another officer." Reynolds felt the weight of everyone's gaze on him, but instead of calming down, his breathing grew heavier. He pressed his lips together, continuing his search for something that would justify his actions. But he found nothing. The situation was escalating, and deep down, he knew he no longer had full control. In a moment of the officer's distraction, Javier slid his hand toward his back pocket, but the slightest movement made Reynolds tighten his grip. "What do you think you're doing?" the officer growled. Javier remained still for a second. Then, as naturally as possible, he responded, "Nothing. I'm just getting comfortable." Reynolds seemed to hesitate. That small window was enough. With a precise movement, Javier pulled out his phone and quickly unlocked it. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey, leave him alone. Why are you arresting him?" He didn't do anything. Reynolds turned for a second, trying to spot the bold voice among the crowd. Javier took advantage of the distraction, dialed a number, and before Reynolds could react, placed the device on the roof of the patrol car with the call in progress. Javier, with his chest still pressed against the patrol car, turned his head slightly and said calmly, "I'm calling my brother. He'll come here to 140 Northeast 39th Street. He spoke loudly, making sure the person on the other end of the line could hear him clearly. Reynolds let out a dry laugh. His confidence was evident. "So what? I don't care who you call," he said mockingly. "Call whoever you want. It won't change anything." In a firm and raised tone, Javier spoke clearly. "Brother, I need you to come. They want to arrest me for no reason." His voice echoed in the air. Reynolds, upon hearing Javier's words, frowned. Something about the certainty in the young man's voice made him hesitate for an instant. Who the hell was he calling? Without wasting more time, his eyes scanned the patrol car until they fixed on the phone resting on the roof of the vehicle. "Who are you talking to?" he asked in a severe tone. Javier didn't respond immediately, keeping his gaze steady straight ahead. That's when Reynolds realized what was happening. The phone was still on the call. His reaction was immediate. Reynolds grabbed Javier's phone and turned it between his fingers, like a predator playing with its prey. The screen was still on. A name flickered on the active call. The officer's jaw tightened. With a twisted smile, he lifted his gaze to Javier and said in a low voice, "Are you expecting someone to come save you?" And with a sudden motion, he hurled the phone forcefully onto the pavement. The phone struck the asphalt, bouncing a couple of times before coming to a stop, its screen still illuminated. Javier clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. Without warning, Reynolds pulled the handcuffs from his belt and clashed them together, producing a metallic sound that put the onlookers on edge. Without Javier offering any resistance, the officer grabbed his arm and twisted it roughly, pushing him against the patrol car. "This just got personal," Reynolds muttered in a low voice, making sure only Javier could hear him. "Are you really going to cuff me for no reason?" Javier asked, keeping his tone firm but without raising his voice. "You have a defiant attitude. I don't like people like you," Reynolds replied with a coldness that sent a chill down Javier's spine. The click of the handcuffs tightening around his wrists echoed through the scene, stirring murmurs among the stunned witnesses. Reynolds, still holding him, leaned in close to his ear and whispered, "Out here, no one is coming to save you." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey, this is wrong. Why are you arresting him?" demanded a woman, holding up her phone and capturing Officer Reynolds' face. But Reynolds completely ignored the protests. With one hand on Javier's back, he forced him to lean slightly while keeping him pinned against the patrol car. Javier gritted his teeth, knowing the situation had escalated to a dangerous point. His only hope was that his brother had heard enough. And if he had, then it was only a matter of time before everything changed. Another man, who seemed to have been watching from a distance, approached with determination. "Leave him alone. You're profiling him," he exclaimed, not taking his eyes off the officer. His tone wasn't just one of simple outrage. There was anger, but also a firmness that made it clear he wasn't going to stay silent. The growing number of onlookers made Reynolds feel cornered, and in an attempt to regain control, his voice rang out with a clear threat. "If you keep recording, I'm going to confiscate your phones. This is not a spectacle." "Oh, really? And what law says we can't record?" Someone from the crowd shot back. "We know what you're doing," added another voice. The murmurs turned into a wave of voices. Some stepped forward, raising their phones defiantly. Reynolds cast a hard look at the crowd, feeling his authority crumble. He took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let them humiliate him. Suddenly, His hand rested on his weapon. He didn't draw it, but the mere motion made some people step back. Someone shouted, "Watch out." Javier, still pressed against the patrol car, felt a knot in his stomach. At that moment, the sound of a siren cut through the air. A second patrol car pulled up a few meters ahead. The driver's door opened, and a pair of officers stepped out with neutral expressions. For a moment, Reynolds felt brief relief, believing the backup would give him greater control over the situation. But their faces showed no intention of intervening. One crossed his arms, the other scanned the crowd. The atmosphere grew thick with uncertainty. The cell phone cameras continued capturing every detail. A chill ran down Reynolds' spine. He was supposed to be in control of the situation, but for the first time since it had all begun, he felt like he was losing his grip. The sound of brakes tearing against the asphalt made several onlookers turn with a start. A sleek black luxury car with an impeccable body came to a sudden stop in front of the scene. Its abrupt arrival interrupted the murmurs of the crowd, drawing looks of curiosity and expectation. The rear doors of the vehicle opened immediately, and out stepped Bad Bunny. His expression was a mix of fury and determination, his upright posture and firm steps exuding an imposing presence. His gaze locked directly onto the patrol car, where Reynolds still held Javier in handcuffs. Despite the noise and the raised cell phones, for an instant, the air felt thick with tension. Officer Reynolds, startled by the sudden arrival, stiffened his stance and narrowed his eyes. He seemed to weigh the situation while his hand instinctively moved toward his belt, as if seeking to reaffirm his authority through the presence of his weapon. But before he could make any move, 4 men in suits stepped out of the same vehicle. Bad Bunny's escorts lined up beside the car. They didn't advance, but neither did they step back. They remained alert, observing every detail with calculated calm, ready to intervene if the situation demanded it. Their mere presence added weight to the moment, stirring murmurs among the spectators. Reynolds reached for his weapon. His gaze flicked between Bad Bunny and the escorts. He knew the law was on his side, but he also knew that one wrong move would put him under intense scrutiny. His knuckles tightened around the gun, and then the crowd erupted in shouts. Bad Bunny strode forward with determination, closing the distance between himself and the patrol car. With each step he took, the tension in the air seemed to rise. The cameras of bystanders followed him, waiting for his next move. Javier remained handcuffed, his face reflecting exhaustion and built-up indignation. However, as soon as he saw him approach, a spark of relief flashed across his eyes. The silence that had momentarily dominated the street was shattered by a sharp command. "Let him go right now," Bad Bunny demanded, his voice firm and cutting. The crowd's attention focused on him. The witnesses' gazes shifted between Javier, the officer, and the unexpected presence of the artist. Reynolds, without letting go of Javier, turned his head with disdain toward the one who dared to give him orders. His expression reflected disgust and superiority. "And who the hell are you?" Reynolds sneered. "Back off, or I'll arrest you too." The tension thickened. For a moment, the surprise silenced the murmurs of the people. Bad Bunny, his jaw clenched, didn't move. His posture openly challenged the officer's authority, who had yet to grasp the gravity of the situation he was in. Then a whisper began to spread among the witnesses. "It's Bad Bunny. What's Bad Bunny doing here?" Record it, record it. Recognition was immediate. Dozens of cell phones shot up, capturing every detail. Within seconds, the street altercation went viral. Reynolds gritted his teeth. His heart pounded with fury. The crowd surrounded him. Cell phones aimed at him like daggers, and that damn man in front of him wouldn't budge an inch. "I told you to back off." He roared, reaching for his waist. A metallic flash. The world seemed to freeze. Gasps turned into screams. Some witnesses stepped back, while others kept their phones steady, recording with trembling fingers. Reynolds drew his weapon and raised it. But his hand wasn't steady. It trembled. He didn't radiate authority. He radiated fear. Bad Bunny's escorts reacted instantly. One of them stepped forward, his arm ready to move. But then, stop right there. The two officers who had been merely observing the scene until now stepped forward, hands on their own weapons. Their faces no longer showed indifference, but pure nervousness. One of Bad Bunny's escorts turned his head, assessing the new threat. It was a dangerous chess game. If they moved, the officers would too. The tension was so thick that no one dared to breathe. And then, in the midst of that silent chaos, Bad Bunny spoke. "If you pull that trigger, your life ends this very instant." Reynolds blinked. A tremor ran through his arm. He was no longer in control. He felt it, he knew it, and that terrified him even more. Bad Bunny took another step forward. His expression left no room for doubt. This wasn't a request. It was a demand. Without raising his voice, but with a firm and authoritative tone, Bad Bunny repeated, "I told you to let him go. You have no idea what you're doing." Reynolds frowned, still holding Javier's arm, but without the same confidence as before. He slowly turned his head toward Bad Bunny, and for an instant, confusion crossed his face. He blinked again, this time not because of the glare of the cell phones, but because the image of the man speaking to him with such determination finally clicked in his mind. Reynolds snorted and clenched his jaw. He couldn't simply back down, not in front of so many cameras. "This is none of your business," he growled, but his voice no longer carried the same firmness as before. Bad Bunny kept his gaze fixed on Reynolds, waiting for him to react. Then Reynolds' grip on Javier loosened slightly. His weapon returned to his belt. His rigid stance became less dominant. His eyes shifted from Bad Bunny to the crowd, then back to him. Officer Reynolds felt the weight of all eyes on him. His breathing became erratic, and a drop of sweat ran down his forehead. He tried to regain his composure, but his voice trembled when he spoke. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, looking around as if searching for an escape. "I was following procedure." He was acting suspiciously. His argument sounded weak, even to himself. Bad Bunny didn't take his eyes off Reynolds. His hands were clenched into fists, but his tone remained firm. Suspicious of what? He was just walking down the street calmly. "Is that suspicious to you?" The crowd murmured in indignation. Some were already live-streaming. Others demanded explanations out loud. A man wearing sunglasses, holding his phone just inches from Reynolds' face, asked, "So stopping and shoving someone for no reason is part of your job?" "Step back," Reynolds ordered, but his voice cracked on the last syllable. No one moved. On the contrary, the phones moved in even closer. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Damn it, he was losing control. Reynolds swallowed hard. No. He refused to identify himself, and his attitude was defiant. His voice lacked conviction. He tried to appear confident, squaring his shoulders, but the crowd no longer believed him. Javier spoke up. "That's a lie. I was just walking. You stopped me for no reason, and when I asked for an explanation, you pushed me against a patrol car." His tone wasn't angry, just certain. "Don't play innocent." Someone shouted from the back. A plastic bottle landed just inches from Reynolds. The officer swallowed again, and for a second, his hand slid toward his gun. The crowd held its breath. Bad Bunny noticed and stepped forward. Just then, sirens tore through the air. The crowd turned their heads in unison as a third patrol car screeched to a halt. Two officers got out quickly. One of them, a burly man with a badge reading Sergeant Morales, scanned the scene with a steely gaze. His uniform was impeccable, and his posture exuded authority. It didn't take him long to grasp the tension in the air. A group of people with their phones raised, a famous man standing with a frown, and his brother still regaining his balance. But what caught his attention the most was the expression on his colleague Reynolds' face. He looked more nervous than any officer should be during a routine intervention. The newcomer fixed his gaze on Bad Bunny and recognized him immediately. His expression hardened as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just any case, not a simple street altercation. The officer took a few steps forward and raised his voice, calm but firm. "I'm going to need cooperation. If any of you have recordings of what happened, please show them." The silence broke with murmurs from the crowd. A group of people began raising their phones, ready to hand over the evidence they had captured. A woman wearing dark glasses and a sports shirt was the first to step forward. She extended her phone and, without hesitation, pressed play. The screen clearly displayed the moment Reynolds shoved Javier against a patrol car for no apparent reason, the way he snatched his phone and threw it onto the street. The footage was undeniable. His jaw tightened as he watched how events unfolded. There was no way to justify Reynolds' actions. The color drained from Reynolds' face as the first recording began to play. His jaw clenched. He looked around, searching for an escape, but all he found were more phones recording. Reynolds let out a nervous laugh, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is a misunderstanding. That guy was acting suspiciously." "Suspicious of what?" Sergeant Morales asked, his gaze unwavering. Reynolds swallowed hard, but couldn't find a convincing answer. Around him, the cameras recorded without mercy. Bad Bunny crossed his arms, his jaw tight as the images spoke for themselves. With every passing second, his breathing grew heavier. When the video ended, he let out a whisper that sounded more like a threat. "This isn't going to end here." Meanwhile, others began offering their videos. Each one showed different angles, all pointing to the same truth. A young man wearing a cap extended his phone, showing a closer shot of the moment Bad Bunny arrived, furious, demanding his brother's release. Reynolds felt a cold sweat run down his back. He lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact with Sergeant Morales. He took a clumsy step backward, as if he had suddenly realized the weight of his actions. His right hand still rested on his belt, but without the firmness it had before. He was trapped between his pride and the growing certainty that he had crossed a dangerous line. "Reynolds, what are you doing?" the officer asked in an authoritative tone. "That man hasn't done anything." His voice cut through the air like an undeniable command. Reynolds swallowed hard and remained silent. His eyes darted from side to side, searching for a way to justify his actions. But he found nothing. The evidence was in all those phones, in the witnesses, in the very voice of his superior. He knew that any poorly chosen word could seal his fate immediately. Javier, still in handcuffs, glanced at his brother, who kept his fists clenched, holding back his anger. Bad Bunny said nothing, but his expression was enough to make it clear that he was not going to allow any more injustice. The crowd, which had grown as more curious onlookers arrived, began shouting louder. "Let him go." Abuse of power. Racist. Sergeant Morales turned his head toward Reynolds and repeated the order with more firmness. "Take off the handcuffs. Now." Reynolds opened his mouth as if to protest, but held back. His fingers trembled as he pulled the key from the keychain hanging from his belt. He stepped toward Javier, who looked at him with a serious expression, but said nothing. With a metallic click, the handcuffs opened and fell from Javier's wrists. A second of silence stretched out, as if the world were holding its breath, until the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Javier rubbed his wrists and lifted his gaze toward his brother. Bad Bunny stepped forward, as if his mere presence sealed Reynolds' fate. Without a word, the two locked eyes. The crowd was still celebrating, but for them, this was only the beginning. Sergeant Morales took a step closer and, with a severe voice, snapped, "You never change, and this time, you're not getting away so easily." The words fell like a sentence upon Reynolds. He knew he had crossed a line that could not be ignored this time. There was no escape. Reynolds clenched his teeth and lifted his chin with a flash of defiance. His gaze swept over the crowd with disdain before locking onto Morales. "Are you really going to do this to me, Morales?" He spat, a mix of rage and disbelief in his tone. "In front of everyone? You know this isn't what it looks like." That guy, he gestured toward Javier with his head, was acting suspicious. "I was just doing my job." Morales didn't flinch. He took another step forward, staring him down. "Oh, really? Because what I see is a cop who just made a huge mistake in front of too many cameras to cover it up." Reynolds swallowed hard but still clung to his arrogance. "And what happens when all this blows over? You know how this works. We always find a way to—" "Not this time," Morales interrupted, his tone dry and final. "The evidence is irrefutable, and it's all against you." Meanwhile, Bad Bunny quickly turned to Javier, whose wrists still bore the marks from the handcuffs. Without hesitation, he embraced him tightly. His hands trembled, and his face was a mix of relief and rage. In a firm voice, though still tinged with concern, he asked, "Are you okay?" Javier nodded, though his expression showed exhaustion and frustration. The injustice of what had happened still weighed on him, but his brother's presence and the support of the people gave him some sense of peace. The crowd remained in tense anticipation. Some continued shouting against the injustice, while others, seeing Javier free, began to applaud. Little by little, the outrage turned into a roar of support. Still holding his brother, Bad Bunny lifted his gaze and addressed the crowd with a firm voice. "This is a clear example of racial discrimination," he said, his tone carrying undeniable indignation. "This cannot keep happening." The crowd held its breath. Reynolds remained standing, motionless, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to protest, that he would try to justify himself, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Finally, with a cold stare, he took a step back, letting go of the last trace of his arrogance. Only then did the crowd begin to react. Among the spectators, a woman in her 30s, with her hair tied back and dark glasses, held her phone firmly. Her name was Daniela Mendez, an independent journalist who happened to be passing through the area when it all began. Her instinct told her that this was more than just a simple arrest. Something didn't add up, and Bad Bunny's presence only confirmed it. Daniela, with years of experience in digital journalism, understood the power of immediacy. Without wasting time, she started a live broadcast from her social media account and began narrating what was happening. As the footage showed Reynolds stepping back and Morales ordering him to release Javier, her voice explained the situation with precision and without exaggeration. "What you are seeing happened just a few minutes ago in downtown Miami. A man was detained for no apparent reason by this officer, identified as Reynolds. As you can see, his brother, the well-known artist Bad Bunny, has intervened, and the situation has become tense. The question is, how many similar cases go unrecorded?" One of the officers approached Daniela with a threatening look. "Miss, stop recording and step back." Daniela did not lower her phone. She knew that if she did, the story could be lost. "It's my right." The officer glared at her, but upon noticing the thousands of people connected and the live comments, he backed off without insisting. Within seconds, the broadcast started receiving comments and reactions. The audience skyrocketed to thousands, then tens of thousands. Influencers and activists retweeted the video, adding their own opinions. In less than 10 minutes, social media was flooded with images of the abuse of power, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForJavier and #RacismInMiami. Meanwhile, at the Miami Police Department, the head of the Internal Affairs Unit, Captain Richard Salgado, received an alert on his phone. His assistant, visibly nervous, showed him one of the videos. "Sir, this is blowing up on social media. We need to do something now." Salgado frowned as he looked at the screen. The image of Reynolds handcuffing Javier while Bad Bunny confronted him was clear, too clear. When Salgado finished watching the video, he slammed his fist on the table. "Damn it," he muttered, his jaw tight. One of his officers tried to calm him. "Sir, we can handle this with a standard statement." "No," Salgado interrupted, rubbing his temple. "This is different. It's Bad Bunny, it's live, it's viral. If we don't act now, we'll be on CNN by tomorrow." He knew the impact would be massive. The recent protests over similar cases had put the police under scrutiny, and this incident, with a celebrity involved, would only increase the pressure. There was no room to ignore it. He stood up from his desk and ordered his team, "Draft an official statement. We're going to announce an immediate investigation." A few minutes later, the official Miami police account posted a statement. "We are aware of the video circulating on social media regarding the arrest of a citizen by one of our officers. The Miami Police Department has launched an internal investigation to clarify the facts and will take necessary measures if any misconduct is found." But instead of calming the situation, the announcement only fueled the fire. The responses were immediate. "How many times have we heard this before? If it weren't for the video, this would never be investigated." Verified accounts of activists and public figures began pushing for concrete actions, demanding Reynolds' suspension and a review of police procedures. On the street, Javier, still with his pulse racing, looked at his brother with relief and gratitude. Bad Bunny, still indignant, patted him on the shoulder and looked at the crowd. He saw the phones held high, the outrage on their faces. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about Javier. It was about every person who had gone through the same thing without a camera to defend them. "I'm going to take care of this," he murmured, his jaw clenched. "And believe me, brother, the whole world is going to know." The echo of the controversy resonated in the headquarters of the Miami Police Department. Just a few hours after the video of the altercation went viral, the offices had turned into a hive of activity. Calls from journalists, emails from outraged citizens, and emergency meetings followed one after another without respite. The pressure on the high command was undeniable. They could not ignore what had happened. In a spacious and austere office, Police Chief Robert Callahan reviewed the footage of the incident with a stern expression. He had seen many complicated cases in his career, but this one was different. The image of Reynolds pushing Javier, the arrival of Bad Bunny, and the public's reaction were irrefutable proof that the situation had spiraled out of control. He let out a frustrated sigh and pressed a button on the intercom on his desk. "Bring Officer Reynolds in, right now." Minutes later, Reynolds entered the office. His posture was rigid, but his eyes reflected the tension of the moment. He knew what was coming, but he still carried a defiant air. "Sit down," Callahan ordered in a grave tone. Reynolds obeyed without protest. The chief observed him in silence for a moment that felt eternal. Then, he slid a thick file across the table. "Do you have anything to say about this?" Reynolds looked at the report without opening it. He already knew its contents. Videos, testimonies, formal complaints. The evidence against him was overwhelming. But instead of taking responsibility, he tried to justify himself. That man was acting suspiciously. I couldn't know who he was. I acted according to protocol. Callahan narrowed his eyes and shook his head. Do you really expect me to buy that? His tone was cold. Reynolds, this isn't the first time you've had issues with these kinds of complaints. But this time, the whole world is watching. I know my record isn't the best in the department. His voice was rough but firm. But it's not all bad. I've put dozens of criminals behind bars. I've taken murderers, thieves, and traffickers off the streets. And because of that, there's less crime in this city. Callahan observed him with a furrowed brow. He leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the desk. I'm not going to say you haven't done good work in certain cases, he admitted. But that doesn't erase what happened yesterday. This isn't just an arrest. This is a scandal, and everyone is watching us. Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, but the chief cut him off with a sharp tone. I can't protect you from this. Not after what you did, and especially not with the pressure we're under. A long silence followed. Reynolds clenched his fists, feeling his anger boil inside, but he knew insisting was useless. You're suspended immediately, Callahan continued, while an internal investigation is conducted. Hand over your badge and your gun. Leave this office right now. It took Reynolds a few seconds to react. He stood up, pulled out his badge and his gun, and placed them on the desk with a sharp thud. Without saying a word, he turned on his heels and walked out of the office, feeling the stares of several colleagues who had already heard the news. As Reynolds left the building, the echo of his suspension spread throughout the city. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForJavier dominated the trends. News reports, interviews, and statements from public figures fueled the debate about police abuse and racial discrimination. Bad Bunny, for his part, did not stay silent. In a live broadcast, with his brother Javier by his side, he spoke firmly. This isn't just about Javier. It's about everyone who has suffered these kinds of injustices. We can't let this keep happening. We're not going to stay quiet. The video reached millions of views within minutes. It was a clear call to action, and that action didn't take long to arrive. The next day, hundreds of people took to the streets of Miami in a peaceful protest. They carried signs with messages of equality and justice. Chants filled the air. The city, which just a day earlier had witnessed an act of abuse of power, was now becoming the stage for an unstoppable movement. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. For Javier, that day had started like any other. But within hours, his story had inspired a multitude. He looked at his brother, feeling a mix of gratitude and determination. They hadn't won the battle yet. But this was only the beginning.